Welcome to the New China Literacy Podcast. This is our first episode. Today's theme is around the rise of great power narrative and our generation's feeling about it. Quick introduction for anyone listening for the first time. We were three young Chinese background analysts who grew inside the system and trained inside and outside it. We have certain insights, not emotion. My name is Yachi, and I was a researcher at RSS NTU Singapore. Today with me is Logan and Henryk. Logan is an undergrad senior student in China Foreign Affairs University, and he has possessed extensive experiences into Chinese industry private consultations. And he was, of course, one of my good friends. He was streaming from Beijing. And second guest of today is Henryk, who is also a senior student from the China Foreign Studies University, majoring in Polish study and language. Let us get into it. Well, guys, first question of the day is very much a personal starter. Let's talk about what is the first time you guys ever encounter this narrative of the rise of a great power. How does it echo with your local environment, the city you were growing in, the community you were nurturing your experiences? Can you just share with us a little more about your background and your life story? Let's start with Henryk.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to make a few adjustments on who I am. I am a student from Beijing Foreign Studies University. Even though our school also trained a lot of Chinese diplomats, we're not like similar to China Foreign Affairs University. We're two independent universities. And then, first of all, I would like to say about the rise of China, because I think that is a topic that none of us could escape once we are in China. My very beginning exposure to such concept was at primary school. We were taught about the core value of socialism was Chinese characteristics. So those, I think, 12 phrases were considered the most important concept that the authorities want people to have. And then in that way, along with that 12 concepts, there were also the concept of Chinese dream. That is that the Chinese nation will gain the rejuvenation with the hard work of Chinese people and under leadership of the Communist Party of China. So that was my earliest understanding of that. After I entered junior high school, we started to learn history. And then in that history course, we learned about basic facts about China, also in geography. And then we were taught in 2015 that China was the second largest economy in the world. At that time, I do recognize that China has become an important player on the global stage. So that was my earliest understanding of the rise of China and the increase of China's international influence from my perspective from school. And since I am from one of the SEZs in China, the special economic zones. So I grew up in a relatively internationalized relations with access to global, of course, education resources and also international people-to-people exchange. So I do recognize that our foreign interlocutors, no matter where they're from, how they live, they do respect China or they do respect Chinese people like us. So at that time, I do think that China was not a nation that is ignored in a global stage.
Well, thank you, Harry. I think that's very inspiring and very personal. So one of the audience actually touched on these specific experiences of traveling into Shenzhen. He was reflecting on how Shenzhen life was so much different from the rest of China. So I think it has something that could anchor with you. As you already mentioned, you were growing up in this Xiamen special economic zone, sitting directly to Taiwan. So how would you describe your growing up in SEED, and how would you describe the differences from moving from that Xiamen Hokkien-speaking city to Beijing? And what is special about growing up in Xiamen?
Xiamen is regarded a important city for a cross-strait integration. And then second, it is a special economic zone, and it has a long history of interacting with international parties, including Southeast Asia and Western nations. So my experience was that Xiamen, even though it's not that economically developed compared to Beijing, Beijing is considered one of the most developed cities in China, but still, Xiamen has a vibrant atmosphere, and then people does have a more open view towards many concepts, including the study of 润学. Now a lot of people would say you could like try to live in a foreign country if you can't like strive in China anymore. However, people from the north would generally consider those people would not accept such concept easily. But however, in the place where I grew up, studying or working in a foreign country was nothing new. We started to do this in like more than 100 years ago. So I think that was a total difference. And also, Beijing is a relatively politicalized city. It is the capital of China, and you can see symbol of China everywhere. Whenever it is titled with the phrase China, you do recognize that it is the heart of a nation, or inappropriately saying heart of an empire with a 5,000 years history, even though it's not empire. So still, Beijing makes me feel different. It has a lot of Soviet style buildings. So I could actually feel the history here, no matter it's the ancient history, the remains of those empires, and also the remains of the socialist period before open and reform policy. So I think Beijing provides me a totally new experience. Also in Beijing, the Taiwan factor will not be mentioned so frequently. However, Xiamen element of Taiwan is everywhere. I mean, there are Taiwanese snacks everywhere, and then basically all you can got on the Chinese delivery food apps, Taiwanese food. But however, in Beijing, it's super hard to get some. So I think that is a huge difference because, of course, Beijing is not a coastal city. It has this relatively like weak connection with Taiwan. So yeah, that is basically my observation for me and for my time in Beijing.
Yeah, I think it's really telling, as you just described. There has been so much cosmopolitan environment in Xiamen where the generations have built this transnational commercial network. And you also talk about the Hokkien-speaking people in that area have actually built a transnational network to migrate into countries like Singapore or North America, which is really amazing. And you also talk about this feeling when you move into the political size capital, the gravity of everything that political into Beijing, and the vibe of the two cities couldn't be more different. So I want to turn to Logan now. How was your city? How was your hometown felt, especially regarding its international exposure? Did you get to meet a lot of important people in your own hometown? And how does it feel like moving from your hometown into the capital of China, Beijing?
First of all, I think I need to briefly introduce myself. I grew up in Jiangsu province, so I think it is one of the more economically developed regions in China. So I think during my childhood, the national development can be directly seen from our city developed infrastructure construction and our life condition improvement. But also I grew up in a relatively small city in Jiangsu province. It is not like the international city like Shanghai or like even like Nanjing. So in my hometown, it is just a small city. You can seldom see like the foreigners in our city. Even up till now, we can see only several African students in the university at our city, but there are not so many foreigners and foreign connections with the local people. But I would like to talk about this or compare the whole region with Beijing from, we always say, Yangtze Triangle. So from the perspective of the daily life of Shanghai or Nanjing, or even Hangzhou people, I think there are much more connection with foreigners. Especially, I think I would like to take the 2010 Shanghai Expo as an example. I think at that time, it is the first time I kind of have the feeling of the national development closely with my daily life. And during that time, I think it is another grand event of the whole country, except for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And during that time, even though I was very young during that time, I can still feel there are much more foreign connection, whatever from my family business connection during that time, or we can see foreigners in the city of Shanghai or in the city of Nanjing. But I think like even 10 years later when 2020, I saw totally different kind of city different from Shanghai or Jiangsu province because as the political center of China, Beijing, especially the universities in Beijing, it provides a much more safer environment for political discussion or even the study of politics, international relations. So I can see and met many more students, foreigners from other countries, and I join the forums meetings with foreign experts. So I think Beijing, it brings us much more political sources and connections with the foreigners. And it is such a huge difference from Yangtze River region that we can see it's much more tend to be economically connected with the foreigners.
Yeah, thank you. I think that story is also very impressive. As you mentioned, you were born and raised up in this Jiangsu province, which is historically named as Jiangnan area, as a composition of this terrain, which is rich and culturally calibrated. And especially, I think the point you raised on the Shanghai Expo resonate with me also very strongly. As I was born in an inland city, unlike you guys, we were much more sufficient in terms of the international exposure, and we don't have any major multinational commercial presence in our city. But I still remember the very vivid moment that I get to be exposed to foreign stuff was in Shanghai 2010 Expo, where I still remember vividly I went to this Portuguese pavilion house. They have this really good leather serving. I also visited that UAE house. They have really good movies showing at that time. So I think the entry point for people like us to get into another world could be examined in a lot of forms. For me, I think because the generational factor really emerged large here, right? For me, where I was growing up in this inland city with no institutional way of getting to know foreign things, I began to know and explore the international world through internet. Especially, I was using this VPN software to bridge the Great Firewall because that was a way I get to download some of the pirated games. That was the channel of this generation, if not mistaken, to get to be connected to international info. So I want to ask this question. In your growth, what are the major informational channels that you find most helpful for you to stimulate your curiosity about the foreign stuff? Is it internet, or is it a book, or is it travel? What is the most impressive single moment or single channel that uh, partly shape your curiosity toward international affairs or international relations as a whole? So let's start with Henryk.
Okay, information on like international affairs is an interesting topic for me. So, after I get into university, I do get a full exposure to foreign information since we are in BFSU. It is an institution that most people here are like having the expertise in a region study or like do a learning a foreign language. But before that, I was a huge fan of the World Affairs magazine. World Affairs magazine was the Chinese version of Foreign Affairs, and it was operate under the monitor of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that magazine was my earliest understanding of national affairs. And also as a member of the Model United Nations community in China, I do started to know about the world through Model United Nations activity as I was reading those magazines from the World Affairs press. So that was my early exposure to the information outside of China. However, it is interesting and presented to the Chinese people in the way that some information were vetted. However, since I do watch Chinese news, so I do know what is happening in the foreign country, but I does not know everything about what's happening in the foreign country because Chinese media will not cover every single news happen abroad. So that was my understanding of the information outside China or information on international affairs. However, after I get into university, like I received tasks about like collecting information from America or Japan or even Europe. So I do have to use Google to search for some information that I have never seen before. Did not change my mind since I do have a perception of how these like the information from these places will project it, like how they will project China or how they will place the China image in these places. However, but the details are pretty shocking for me because I did not expect that because I did not expect those would like China would be described in that way. So it's kind of a shock, kind of cultural shock, but however, I get used to it. And I do not think like getting exposure to such information does change my general opinion of the country that I'm in or the surroundings that I live in it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think the reflection upon this issue is very telling because from my perspective, the information access itself is a form of class privilege in China because I was growing up, I was surrounded by those peers some of them were much more inward looking, and some of whom who were like not that curious regarding the foreign affairs. I still like much to today, I feel like we are living in different world of informational ecology, right? And you also talk about how do the environment nurture capacity to self-research, to self-search and build this international literacy. I'm afraid that this is not an intention of any educational institution for you to nurture such thing, right? So I want to turn to Logan upon the kind of entry point for international study. How was the formative experiences? How was information exposure that got you interested into the study and finally enroll in the China Foreign Affairs University and as a major?
Okay, so I think it is kind of very interesting for me to get some exposure to international relations. So at the first 2 years of my undergraduate study, I majored in international communication. At that time, I learned a lot about journalism, about communication theories, but I also minored in diplomacy. So the turning point came from one course during my minor studies. It is the political science study. During that time, I think it's a main way for me to engage in serious studies with international affairs and different perspectives to have conversations with my professors. So the professor of political science is a former diplomat from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we always talked a lot about these different international affairs and his opinions on China's diplomacy. And he always talked with me about historic events, especially during the beginning of China's reform and opening up. So some of the historical events he mentioned cannot be found in China's internet. Whatever social media or the books you can find in the libraries. So it was my first time to search like this, some kind of sensitive political events of China through VPN to get access of these different international media, all the academic information. And through this process, I think I learned more about the truth of politics. Before that, I think the country is a machine can be operated very strictly and without the humanity of all of these things. But at that time, when I get to the VPN and get to the side world, I think it is so interesting to engage a different narrative from our domestic communication. For example, the Belt and the Road Initiative and the domestic communication, the domestic narrative is different from the international narrative, from the foreign media exposure and the reports. And during that time, I think it is so interesting and it attracts me to find out how can a country behave itself better and how these difference between different countries can help us to engage in our daily life, can make our individuals in this society, in this era can be better.
Yeah, I think the points you mentioned here is really important as a generation cohort of younger students coming to college. They are starting to try to make sense of their own country. I mean, especially you were talking about some of the historical events that define Chinese modern politics, which actually provides a foundation for any term of policy study or the statecraft study. So we were also talking about this great power narrative. What does it promise and how was it actually delivered, right? So I want to turn into this very specific question in your cohort, in your institution. What was the student looking for when they entered the first year of freshman studies? What they envision themselves to be? Maybe I guess from a foreign affairs university could be a very institutionalized track. Some of them could envision themselves to be a diplomat. And I think for Beijing Foreign Studies University, which is people call it a cradle for the diplomat, translator, and administrative officials, you could also envision some position in the Chinese foreign policy apparatus. But after those 4 years, after the journey concluded, what are those students choosing to take in their future track? So how was the transformation feel like in your own environment? So let's turn to Harry first.
Becoming a diplomat was one of my dream as I entered this university. However, I do recognize that among all the foreign languages that our university does provide as a bachelor's program, some of them were not needed by the Foreign Office every year. Some of them are needed. For Arabic, English, French, and German, those languages are spoken in many nations. Our Polish was a language spoken in Poland and a small population in Ukraine and in Slovakia. So as a fun fact, throughout the 4 years, me and my other classmates were never offered the chance to even to try to get enrolled into or to get admitted to the Chinese Foreign Service. Such gap were existent, and then such gap were found by students. So I think people just turn to other ways to get a job. As we are about to conclude our 4 year time in Polish studies, I think like the majority of us would choose to study for master's degree, and a few of them were deciding for a job, and then a lot of them were in business sectors that are related to China Poland business exchange. There are also people who want to study Polish as a master's degree, and then they do want to dedicate it to the China Poland people to people exchange in their future. So I think, of course, there is always a gap between reality and rhetoric. And the promise made by the school or the education authority will not be realized 100%. I do think that students of our places, people of our generation, do know how to adjust the goals and then fight for the things that is achievable instead of sticking to a high target or a goal that will be hard to achieve in foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think the story itself is very much a reflection of the global ambition that Chinese state or to have to build a foreign policy team that is capable of grasping the global knowledge and language, especially when you're talking about like the limited access and need for foreign ministry to recruit people with Polish language background. As we see in recent years on the state planning level, there has been an incredible increase into project of area studies of a subject that is more policy oriented and more programmatic for the foreign policy team. But actually in the real life, we also see this between what the states are rhetorically portraying to the society as are saying they are in need of more talents, foreign language, foreign area knowledge. But in real life, it was almost always in this match. And I think this is very interesting because I still can be flooded with a daily post showing those people enrolling in such subjects, for example, like Polish language or area study as a master project. They fail to grasp what the professional outlook going to be because they fail to understand the 顶层设计, which is the state design, the global ambition that when the Ministry of Education were trying to project all the resources into building a new agenda of those new department faculty. So I want to turn to Logan. How was the cohort like in their freshman study? Are they also attracted or intrigued by this vision of becoming future diplomat? And when they encounter the reality, when they encounter some of the barrier difficulty of entering the ministry, how do they adjust themselves for future uncertainty? for a future career outlook that is not on the paper?
I think it is mainly divided into two different situations. The first one is me who were affected by the narrative of major power rising like this during our high school time. The Chinese diplomacy become very visible online, especially during the period often described as wolf warrior diplomacy. So the spokesman of Ministry of Foreign Affairs like Wang Yi, Geng Shuang, Zhao Lijian, they suddenly become the famous star in public and especially on the internet. So I think half of us are intending to enter the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to become a diplomat like Wang Yi or like Geng Shuang to fight for our national interests. I think this is some of us, including me, and the rest of the people. They entered China Foreign Affairs University due to the university selection system, because China Foreign Affairs University is the first session of the university admission selection. So some people just put it on their list and finally they come to China Foreign Affairs University, and actually they can go to other comprehensive universities like other 9, 5, 8 universities, which they think may be better. It turns out to be different choices, results after the 4 years of undergraduate study. Like the first type of people like me, some of us still choose to get to the admission examination of Ministry of Foreign Affairs like me 1 year ago. And finally, it turns out with a film. But still, I think some of us gave up this opportunity because there are two gaps. The first gap, it can be a gap between life and dream, because after 4 years of learning of life, the day life and work in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they are lower salary and highly competitive working environment. If you do not have such a sincere dream of China's development, major power rising, I think few people can stick to it. And I think there are more and more people, they escape from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It affects more and more students at China Foreign Affairs University. And then the second gap is the gap between your political idea and the system selection. If do not have so much political results that can support you to conduct your political ideas in such a huge system, foreign affairs system, I think you can only be a small part of this huge system. It is such a huge difference from what we can see from the internet on the TV. It can be a total different life from Wang Yi and Geng Shuang. So more and more students, they are realizing this reality, so they are giving up like this. But still some students like me, we choose to have a try, but it turned out a failure. And the rest of people who succeed this year, like us who major in English or major in international communication, they have to change their language from the major language of English to like French, Spanish, even some much more small language like Arabia, like this. So I think these are all the people who choose to still stick to the dream of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And for people like us who have failure, I think during the 4 years of study, we still find out some other approaches for our future. I think most people, they choose to pursue a master's degree, whatever, in China, or like me, tried to pursue a master's degree abroad. I think it also a trend of China's undergraduate student, not only for students at China Foreign Affairs University, but also for, I think most 80% of students need to pursue a master's degree to help them to get a better job career development in the future. Most people can be affected from this and choose a major of international relations like me, or diplomacy, or like all of these. I think they still have the dream of diplomacy and international relations, but we just choose another path which different from government agencies. We can go into, like me, to the government affairs consulting firms, and some of them will go to the think tanks or universities to continue to spread their ideas of international relations and how our country will develop in the future. It is kind of a gap between high school students and the university students. So in high school time, we prefer to choose career development of our dream. But 4 years of undergraduate study, I think more and more students, they realize what is reality, and we need to have our own life. The focus gradually turn from the whole country, the whole nation to individuals. I think it is also the trend of today's Chinese student. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Logan. Especially regarding your experiences of being intrigued by the popular image of so-called White and the deep dive corp. I was very much in sync with you. When I was 17, 18 years old, I became so addicted to some of the video content of that time. I still remember vividly that I was watching this argument which emerged out of the 2021 Alaska meeting between the Chinese and the American national security team. So, when that meeting unfolded, there was such a big heated debate between the foreign minister and the CFAC director Yang Jieqi with American counterpart at the time. So I still remember vividly that I was printing their script, printing at paper, and I read it out somewhat as a reading material for me. So that was really intriguing, as initially the popular image or the general narrative of so-called great power attracted some of us of adopting this measure as more of a vision for a cause, for a scared collective imagination. But as you amazingly illustrate, when it came to the ground, when it came to our individual choices, throughout the years, actually, the image become much more clear with a much more realistic approach about figuring out our own niche in the policy industry in Beijing. As you mentioned, you already find your niche in the private policy consultation industry. So I want to turn to another very important question of the time, which is how those students in your own cohort, in your classroom, how much do you feel their passion or their curiosity of foreign study or the foreign knowledge at whole? And do you agree that the entire generation of China, I mean, an external observer are saying they are becoming much more aggressive, nationalistic, and inward-looking? And how would you evaluate based on your own observation? What is the generational feature of the time feel like to you? Let's turn to Harry for this question.
Okay, so it's an interesting topic, and then your description of this question reminds me of what Peter Hassler mentioned in his book "Other Rivers: Chinese Education." He referred to students at Sichuan University at his time. I think it was in 2019 or even earlier, or even a little bit later, Generation Sheep. And it is because these generation of students were grow up under the leadership of President Xi Jinping, who has been serving as the Chinese president since 2012. I think, no, 2013. So yeah, but it is the Generation Xi. So of course that the influence of the major political trend, major political movements domestically, internationally had a huge impact on Chinese people. And of course, there are significant influence to the Chinese students, the young generation of Chinese people. I wouldn't say I'll represent others, but I'll say like people around me, they were not looking inward. Quite the opposite. As we are growing up, as we're getting more access to international relations or international affairs, we are somehow looking more outward. We do care about what happens in a foreign country, we do care about what the implications of the international incidents would be. And then also, what are the influence of these incidents would have on China? So those were, I'll say, like how our people react to what's happening outside world. Of course, as I mentioned before, there is a gap between rhetoric and reality. And then I said that people around me are still striving for it, even though there are still challenges, tremendous challenges among me or among other Chinese students, young generation of Chinese people, like my roommates or my classmates or my friends at university. But still, I think people are not willing to give up. People are not willing to give up their to stop striving for no matter what it is, a better job, a chance to get into the master program, or the chance to enhance on their capacity or to say nourish themselves with knowledge or skills. So I think even though we're still in huge pressure or people will say some words to express our frustration, but still life goes on even though there's massive frustration or there are massive disappointment. Like, even for survival, I think major gender Chinese people, like Chinese young people, are not satisfied with the status quo, especially a lot of people could not find a satisfied job, or a lot of people fail to find out what they do want to do in the coming future when they left the campus. But still, I think people just not willing to give up, even though there are short period of disappointment or short period of unable to understand what the reality. But still, even if they cannot cope with what they're going to face, they will still get used to it. No matter they give a resistance against the odds, or they just begin to cooperate and then no longer feel unsatisfied of the reality. But still, they will still fight for it, no matter it's for their survival or for their own career development or future development. Even though sometimes such future development or career development were a constructed concept, those are not solid from another's perspective. But still, I don't think people could judge others, their plans or their opinions, basically on one side, like opinions or thoughts. So yeah, I'll basically say mention I feel like my observations or my thinking on that issue.
Yeah, I think your points are really valid in some here. And you're right. I mean, especially in our circles about those students who study foreign policy or foreign knowledge as a whole are much more cosmopolitan, are lower looking compared with some of the peers which do not have such access or such professional training. So it came to me that to how much degree that experiences are shared and representative. I think that's a really interesting question. And I think your sharing directly corresponds to the sharp criticism actually delivered by Tsinghua professor Yin Shitong. So Professor Yan once mentioned that the people who were born after 2000 had this habit of view the world at eye level. He meant something negative. He meant this generation as a whole, or as his students in his program felt much more superior outside world and cannot take a very realistic view to deliver sound analysis of statecraft. But I think your sharing really balanced that one-side narrative. So I want to turn to Logan. How would you describe the entire generational culture of your cohort when they are exposed to the foreign country? Are they somewhat more confident, more assertive, or are they much more rational, or they are just like their international counterpart?
From my observation, I don't think Chinese students today are simply becoming more radical, more aggressive, or more conservative. What I see is actually a growing diversity of political attitudes. Although I think the Chinese environments does not encourage the expression of especially students' political attitudes. So I think there are two different types. On one hand, I think some students have developed a stronger sense of national identity and more willing to defend China's position in international debates in some coursework. I think there are more and more students preferring to learn about Belt and Road Initiative and such kind of so-called China's grand narrative. And this is partly shaped by the media environment and also by the experience of growing up during the period. I think now China's global presence has become much more visible. More and more students just have such kind of strong sense of national identity. They have a growing confidence in national development, especially future development like the Chinese artificial intelligence, like DeepSeek and all of this. I think more and more students are trying to use this. They criticize about ChatGPT or Claude, and they think sometimes they think DeepSeek is much more better, especially during the time of the rise of DeepSeek. But I think also on the other hand, there are also many students who have become more pragmatic and reflective. especially I think students majoring in international relations and relative like diplomacy, political science, I think they are entering university and being exposed to different academic perspective. It is very important to have some exposure to international idea, opinions. The students, they tend to think more critically about international politics. I still remember during a youth side event last month, I attended, the students from Tsinghua University, from Peking University, think more critically about China's behavior in international society. They are reflecting about what should China do and how China can behave better in the international society and how to take much more responsibility instead of just criticizing the United States. And I think people are becoming more and more interested in understanding how China is perceived globally. I still want to mention another very interesting trend, and it is also from Henryk's observation. They actually are less ideological, more practical than people might expect. One factor is China's environment. It does not encourage the expression. Meanwhile, I think students have become more and more realistic and anxious about their own future development. That's what I said in the last question about the students. They are gradually turning from the whole nation to individuals. They are more and more anxious about their future. They are not satisfied, especially students like me, now a senior undergraduate, or the second year, the third year master students. They do not satisfied with the job market. They cannot find out satisfying job position and career development path. But I still think the majority of these students are from social science. I think students who major in artificial intelligence or computer science, they probably will not worry about find out a better job, more money. But I think actually more and more students who are not so excellent in the job market, their conversations among these young people focus much more concrete concerns like career, economic opportunities, technological changes like artificial intelligence can cut down the job opportunities, especially about the social science and all the global mobility like the US-China competition can lead to less opportunities for Chinese students to find a job in Washington, D.C. or even in California. It is rather than the purely political debates, it's much more about our daily life, and it is still very closely connected to our future development. So I would like to say the most important change is not a shift toward one single direction, whether it's the political ideas of the Chinese students become more polarized. I think it is the emergence of a more pluralistic and the nuanced set of views among Chinese students and how we'll position ourselves in the future in the society, even in the whole international society.
I very much agree with your take on the constructual constraint that is posed upon most Chinese graduates today, which sort of limits their impulse or transformation to such an ideologically driven persona. I think what you described really hits the ground because when it comes down to the decision making of the individuals, we found this generation to be much more divergent. They are not sharing a common text. I mean, not a common culture or common reading upon some of the shared text. Of course, they are not sharing one single predominantly or in a coherent ideology. I mean, that could be a good thing and a bad thing, right? On the good side, I think you can argue that they are much more driven with the calculation on the ground, the cost benefit, and their struggle for daily life seem to exceed that of the grand narrative. I mean, exceeds that of the ideological impulse to transform the order to a degree. On the bad, I can also argue that, okay, since now we are much more absent of a common cultural or generational trend that defines this generation, we as individual could become much more individualized and becoming much more mutually hostile to each other and be driven into what we might call as evolution, driven into a rat race, as some might call. So upon that point, I think we should also relate to this very much personal question upon the ultimacy. So the three people of us, I think we basically have a lot of the user exchange experiences with American students as with other foreign participants on the ground. So Henryk, I know you've been going around in Beijing with different national, with some of the short-term scholars even. And I think Logan, you also have this international exposure as you just finished the visit to Stanford and California youth exchange event. I think also in the coming Xi summit they're going to held in Beijing, the youth exchange will also be a low-hanging fruit for the two sides to reach a certain degree of cooperation. It symbolized a lot, but actually operationally it was not that hard to break the wall. But I want to ask, based on your own personal experiences, when you are living through the youth diplomacy exchanges with the foreigners, how important, how much is useful? I mean, in terms of how they're going to shape our perception of each other, and how much decision makers should attach importance to such exchange programs. So I want to ask this question first to you, Henryk.
Well, so since I am in the library to talk to you about my experience and the library is about to close, so I will give a short answer. So first of all, I'll say that people-to-people exchange matters, and then cultivating the sense of dialogue and cooperation for young generation matters, because one day I still believe that this generation will become the leader of our nation, perhaps in 50 years or 60 years' time. So I think such conversation matters, and it is also critical for future foreign leaders to come to China, as long even though they're still kids, or even though they're teenagers or university students. People to exchange people to people dialogue like such sim could enhance mutual understanding. That's quite official, but however, after my conversation with international students in China, or with other students from other places, I do recognize that people are all living in a atmosphere that many information not were not able to get without like first-hand experience. I'll say that this is still important, and I do encourage people to talk to, especially young generation, to talk to like the people of their age in another nation, in another country, or from other cultural backgrounds, because I think it could enhance. Speaking of, it's like broaden horizon, but there shouldn't be that official. Still, I think talking to foreigners, for Chinese students, it will be interesting experience at least. Sure, like you would get some different experience, and of course, like you enhance your cultural, intercultural communication skill set. Also, I'll say that doing so will help. Doing so will help you understand like what are your position in a more general, in a more like in a more wide, or I'll say in a bigger place, what country you're living in, and what kind of people you are in your country, and what kind of people you are if you live in a foreign country. Such comparative way of analyzing things will be interesting, or I think it will be innovative, or at least trigger more thinkings about your life of yourself, and then life in your own nation. I think that's relatively interesting.
Thank you, Henryk. And I want to pose this question back to Logan, because you have a lot of foreign exchanges. How did you assess the role of youth in terms of their contribution to the foreign policy, to the generally the international peace maybe? And thinking from cliche, what substantial role you think the Chinese youth nowadays could play in a world that is defined by great power competition?
For me, I have been to the United States in January. So personally, I think interacting with foreign students has been very much important in shaping how understand the international politics, because students majoring in international relations, especially like us, focus on U.S.-China relations. I think it is very important to know the other side. I know it is not a quite suitable metaphor. In Chinese, there is a quote like 知己知彼，百战不殆. So if you know the other, you know the so-called enemy better so you can win more. I think it is very important for us to learn more about the international society, especially the United States. So it is different from what you have read from these articles, especially the articles of the experts. When you interact or talk with the young students from the United States, you can get to know much more different opinion, how they think about the country. During my visits in the United States, still so many young students, they do not agree with the Trump's administration. So it is so different, especially when us read about global issues through media, academic texts. So the discussion can sometimes feel quite abstract. But when you talk directly with people from different countries, from face to face, you can begin to realize how differently the same events can be perceived. And I think the conversation helped me understand that many disagreements between the countries are not only about policies. Sometimes it's about narratives. I think most of us will understand the US-China competition from economic or industrial competition. But I think sometimes when you talk to American students or even students from the European Union, they will say that's not the case. They will talk something more. Especially during my visits in the United States, you will find out that there are so many young students in the United States. They pay so much attention to the Tibetan issue in China. But I think none of Chinese students will pay attention to such an issue. But there are so many people, they know so much about Tibetan issue and Dalai Lama. And so many, I think sometimes it can be sensitive political issues in China. But I think non-young students in China will care about this. But they do have so many young students in the United States. They major in such kind of questions, issues, and they know so many about it. And I think most of their distrust about China are stemming from these issues. If we have never talked with these students, we can never know, we can never solve these problems between the United States and China, between the European Union and China. I think youth exchange are very important for the relationship between China and the United States. I think in November 2025, I went to Hong Kong to join kind of forum, and the theme of this forum is how to build up or to reduce mistrust between the United States and China. And one key solution they mentioned and they proposed is to maintain the youth exchange between the two countries. I think it is very important when the two countries now are facing increasing strategic competition, and especially official dialogue channels sometimes can become limited or more formal. So in this context, I think communication between students and young professions can play a complementary role, because it helps maintain I think kind of certain level of mutual understanding. Of course, I know, especially now in the United States, like students from Columbia University, they due to kind of political sensitivity or the censorship, they prefer not to come to China or have kind of a youth exchange with Chinese students, because now the competitive situation from the American administration towards China. I still think it is very important for these decision makers, both in China and the United States, do not to cut down the youth exchange between the two countries, because I think it can influence the long-term environment, shape how the next generation perceive each other especially most of them can be the future policymakers, and they think and they make decisions. So in the long run, I think the youth change can help reduce misunderstanding and build a more informed perspective on the both sides.
Thank you, Logan, for that insightful sharing. So I very much agree with you upon the essential importance of keeping the channel open of the youth exchanges. But still, I would like to offer a pushback about this. Some of the format, some of the channel being politicized, and with that restraint, there may be a limitation about how much the two youth cohort could really engage with each other on similar channel. But we still very much appreciate that point that we should very much highlight the importance of a transnational intellectual framework of the youth exchanges. Okay, so that is all of the episode today. We have 3 Chinese Gen Z analysts who have, of course, divergent narrative about how they are growing up with the time, especially with the rising state of China. This episode is the very much first episode that we launched, and next episode is not too far away. We'd like for you to subscribe to our channel, and thank you for attending this wonderful conversation.